Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for signing into the latest Economics and Finance Academy. Today's presentation will discuss how permanent trust funds can help states save for the long term. I'm Faith James. I staff the CSG West Finance Committee. I'll be your moderator. There will be time for questions at the end of today's presentation. If you have a question at any time, you may enter it into the GoToWebinar interface. Our speaker will then take as many questions as time allows once the presentation has concluded. Brenna Erford is here with me as well today. She's the manager of the State Fiscal Health Project for the Pew Charitable Trust. She's going to give us some background on the Pew Charitable Trust and introduce our speaker today.
Thank you, Faith, and thank you everyone on the webinar today. Let me just tell you a few things about Pew. As many of you know, Pew is an independent nonprofit organization that works to lay the foundation for effective policy solutions by informing and engaging citizens, linking diverse interests to pursue common cause, and insisting on tangible results. Our state fiscal health team provides data analysis and guidance to help states navigate their fiscal challenges and identify and understand potential policy approaches. We examine trends in state economies and budgets, and we research and advance promising approaches to managing volatile state finances in an era of heightened uncertainty. And today, we'll hear from my colleague Patrick Murray, a senior associate on our team. Patrick's going to present some of the key findings and recommendations from our forthcoming work on state sovereign wealth funds. Patrick?
Thank you so much, Brenna. If we could advance the slide. If we could just advance the slide one. One more, please. Perfect. So thank you so much for joining me today to talk about our research on U.S. severance tax-based sovereign wealth funds. So to give a quick overview, in this presentation I'm going to address three questions. First, what are sovereign wealth funds? Second, what purposes can sovereign wealth funds serve? And finally, how does that purpose inform these funds' governance and management? Slide. Perfect. So, what are sovereign wealth funds? Simply put, these funds are just an investment fund that is managed by a sovereign entity, either a country or a U.S. state. To give you a quick sense of the international scope, outside of the United States, there are currently 77 funds under management in countries ranging from China, France, Russia, and Kuwait. And in total, these funds outside of the United States manage an estimated $8.2 trillion. So in terms of the why, the goal of these funds generally is to generate investment returns to achieve specific long-term public goals. At the international level, these goals can include paying pension funds, investing in state-owned enterprises, providing macroeconomic stabilization, and facilitating economic development. Now these funds can take many different types of forms. So for our research, we took a narrow focus on severance tax-based sovereign wealth funds managed by U.S. states. What we mean by this is that the principal of these funds comes from state taxes on mineral extraction, and then a set percentage of the revenue from these taxes gets deposited into a trust fund that then invests the proceeds. This is notable as severance taxes are generally one of the more volatile revenue sources for states, and they come from a finite resource. Slide. So before I go too deeply into what exactly sovereign wealth funds look like in the states, I wanted to put them in the context of the different types of funds of states. So states generally divide their finances across a variety of funds, which we classify here as operating funds and non-operating funds. Operating reserve funds are liquid accounts, basically cash and cash equivalents. They have more short-term goals, things like budget stabilization and supporting day-to-day operations and other ongoing expenditures. Examples include state general funds and rainy day funds, which we'll get to in a minute. So these are, like I said, short-term liquid accounts. And on the right side, you see non-operating funds. These types of funds are invested in more long-term, higher-risk assets, something like private equities, that, while riskier, offer the opportunity for a higher return. And the main goal of these funds, as opposed to operating funds, is simply maximizing investment returns. Example includes pension funds and today's topic, sovereign wealth funds. Slide. To give you a broad overview of what sovereign wealth funds look like in current U.S. states, there are 7 states that have severance tax-based sovereign wealth funds. As you can see from the map, this is Alaska, Montana, North Dakota, Wyoming, Utah, New Mexico, and West Virginia. I'll note that Louisiana has currently proposed a ballot initiative to create a sovereign wealth fund, and it will vote on it this November. So as you can see, these sovereign wealth fund states are generally energy-rich states. And actually, of the states that derive more than 5% of their revenue from severance taxes, there are only 2, not including Louisiana, that don't have a sovereign wealth fund. These 2 states are Texas and Oklahoma. Slide. Can we advance the slide, please? So now we're good. Sorry, go one back. Perfect. So when we look at the structure of a sovereign wealth fund, the most important element of a sovereign wealth fund is the purpose. Having a really clear, defined purpose for the sovereign wealth fund is then going to help inform the rest of the elements of the fund. So for instance, we look at governance policies. Now, as I said earlier, sovereign wealth funds are generally large investments, and they require continuous monitoring of these investments to maximize possible earnings. Having a clear purpose helps create a governance structure that then serves the goals of the fund and can drive the fund forward. These funds also require a dedication to transparency to ensure that the public has access to performance data. A great example of a fund with a strong governance policy is the Alaska Permanent Fund, which is managed by the state-owned entity, the Alaska Permanent Fund Corporation. This corporation is overseen by a 6-member governor-appointed board of trustees, and they review, adopt, and monitor an asset allocation strategy for the fund. After governance policies, we take a look at fund usage, particularly how the state can withdraw from the fund, including investment earnings and the principal of the fund. Now, decisions about when and how to withdraw from the fund also need to flow from the purpose, as these decisions can significantly impact the fund's growth in the long term. When you look at earnings, should the state reinvest their earnings back into the sovereign wealth fund? Should it invest it into operating funds? Perhaps it should invest in infrastructure? These decisions all need to come from the purpose. Same with the principal. Accessing the principal can have a significant impact on the fund's long-term growth. So if a state is going to access the principal, it needs to have a clear reason why that aligns with the purpose of the fund. Finally, we have risk management. Now, since sovereign wealth funds are larger long-term investments, states can afford to take on more risk than they would in their operating funds. But the purpose of the fund needs to guide exactly how much risk could be too much. This is especially true if the state depends on these funds to support their ongoing operations in any way. For instance, 5 of the 7 states transfer at least a share of their fund investment earnings to their general fund. They should consider the impact of these earnings on their overall portfolio, particularly if these earnings become volatile. An example of this is Wyoming's Permanent Wyoming Mineral Trust Fund. The earnings of this fund, the state diverts a portion of them to their general fund, which effectively makes it a revenue stream for the state. Now, in recent years, these earnings have become an increasingly large share of the state's portfolio. At the same time, these earnings have also become more volatile. So this is a situation that the state needs to keep an eye on to ensure that these earnings provide a strong structure for the state. Slide. Now when we talk about purpose, in our research we identified 3 major purposes for sovereign wealth funds. And on this slide I give an overview of each while providing an example from a sovereign nation. So our first main purpose is intergenerational savings. And funds that focus on intergenerational savings are designed to transfer wealth across generations by converting things like non-renewable assets into investments that help diversify the state economy and ensure the continuation of revenue once a resource has been exhausted. An example of this is Norway's government pension fund Global, which is currently has an investment of about $878 billion in US dollars. And the fund defines a very clear purpose, quote, "One day the oil will run out, but the return on the fund will continue to benefit the Norwegian population." The next purpose we identified is specific targeted development. And this is using the fund to support a specified industry or to provide a designated service to the people or fund infrastructure development. A great example of this is United Arab Emirates Mubadala Development Company. And the United Arab Emirates uses this fund to directly invest in industries ranging from aerospace engineering to renewable energy, semiconductors, and public utilities. And finally, the third purpose we identified is budget stabilization. And this is when a nation builds savings during growth periods and then using interest accruals, investment income, and even in some cases the principal to supplement operating revenues during periods of economic decline. And the goal here is to smooth over public spending year to year to prevent shocks to the overall economy. An international example here is Mexico's Oil Revenue Stabilization Fund, which stated purpose is, quote, to minimize the effect on public finances and the national economy when oil revenue declines occur. So Mexico uses this fund as a broad macroeconomic tool. Specifically, it uses it as a hedge against the country's risk from declines in oil prices. And I'll note that other countries achieve stabilization in different ways using their sovereign wealth funds. Now, this purpose isn't generally used by U.S. states for their severance tax-based sovereign wealth funds because states don't set their own monetary policy. They can't print money, they can't set interest rates, or issue debt to finance governmental operations. So in the U.S., states stabilize budgets year to year, most often through tools like rainy day funds and other operating funds. Slide. So when we look at the map, we looked through each state's severance tax-based sovereign wealth fund and tried to put it in one of those categories of purposes. So as you can see, the majority of states fall into the first category, intergenerational savings, and those are the green states you see here on the map. I will note, of these 6 states, Alaska is the only state to clearly define this purpose in law. With the other states, it's more of an implied purpose. We also have West Virginia as the only state that has a stated purpose of specific targeted development. And again, this purpose is in law. So now that we've seen this map, let's take a deeper look into some individual state examples. Slide. So what I want to do is go through each of the 3 purposes and provide a state example. Now, our first purpose is intergenerational savings. And as I said before, the goal here is to build up wealth in the long term to benefit future generations. And this is especially important for severance tax-based sovereign wealth funds, as they allow states to capture wealth from a finite resource and turn it into long-term revenue. Slide. And the best example we have here is Alaska. Again, Alaska is the only state to clearly state this purpose in law. It's also the oldest sovereign wealth fund in the United States. It was started in 1976 as the construction of the Alaskan oil pipeline was drawing to a close. And as you can see, the purpose is very clearly stated. Conserve a portion of the state's revenue from mineral resources to benefit all generations of Alaskans. And then the state aligned the management and governance of this fund to align with that purpose. So can the state withdraw from the principal? No, as that would diminish wealth in the long term. The state reinvests the majority of its investment earnings back into the fund itself. It also uses some of these earnings to invest in the general fund and also to pay dividends to individual Alaskan citizens. Now, I should note that in recent years, Alaska has seen a dip in its severance revenues due to falling energy prices, and that could potentially lead the state to adjust the purpose of the fund, which would then lead to a reconsideration of practices and policies regarding the fund. So that's something worth keeping an eye on. Slide. Now the next purpose we have is targeted development. And that's thinking about how to use the wealth of these funds to fund services and support infrastructure. Again, this is important for severance tax-based sovereign wealth funds as it provides a tool for the state to diversify its economy and reduce its reliance on oil and natural gas moving forward. Slide. And again, the only state to clearly state this purpose in law is West Virginia. West Virginia created its sovereign wealth fund in 2014 when revenues from severance taxes had reached a historic peak, more than doubling to $680 million from $300 million in 2005. Now, a large portion of this was attributable to a boom in mineral extraction, particularly fracking. So when the state recognized this new revenue, state lawmakers decided to try to capture it by creating the West Virginia Future Fund. Now, as you can see, the fund is still new and currently has a balance of $0, but the state can't withdraw from the principal or use investment earnings until after 2020, at which point it will use these funds in alignment with its purpose, which, as you can see here, is to enhance education, workforce development, economic development, etc. Slide. And then finally we come to budget stabilization. Now, again, budget stabilization with sovereign wealth funds is usually a tool for sovereign nations as they have more control over their monetary policy. With states, this isn't really a possibility, so states generally try to achieve year-to-year budget stabilization through more liquid, lower-risk operating funds, but typically they're rainy day funds. Now, rainy day funds are a very important tool for states, and slide. We can give you a picture of what this looks like nationally currently. So, as you can see, rainy day funds are a very popular tool for states. A lot of this comes from the fact that most states, 49 states, are required by law to maintain a balanced budget. So actually the only state that isn't required by law is Vermont, and as you can see, they still have a rainy day fund. The only 3 states that don't have rainy day funds are Montana, Colorado, and Illinois. And I'll also add that this is an area where a lot of states are paying increased attention. Since 2007, 22 states have reformed their rainy day funds in some way. That can include changing deposit rules, changing caps on the fund, or even creating a fund. Kansas created its fund this year. Slide. And I'll mention here that if you're interested in learning more about rainy day funds, Pew, we've done a lot of work in this area. We've released 3 reports on sound rainy day fund design, helping states look at volatility in their state budgets, creating best practices for depositing money, and helping to define the purpose and right-sizing rainy day funds. So we can help. If anyone is interested in learning more about these reports, please let us know. Slide. So through this research, we identified a few next steps for policymakers in looking at their sovereign wealth funds. First comes back to that main idea that I've been pushing in this presentation, which is identifying a clear purpose. And not just identifying a clear purpose, but clearly stating that purpose in the state law. That way it's clear, everyone is on the same page, and again, the other elements of the sovereign wealth fund can then align to that purpose. Which comes to my next point, establishing policies for the governance, investment, and public disclosure of the fund's activities, and again, putting that in law so it's clear and expected. And I'll say that regarding these policies, there are many well-defined international and domestic precedents for these types of policies, and again, if people are interested, just let us know and we can follow up. Third comes regarding the principal. As I stated earlier, withdrawing from the principal can be a tricky scenario because withdrawing from the principal can then create a feedback loop in the portfolio that can significantly reduce the wealth of the fund in the long term due to compound interest. So again, states need to look at the purpose of their fund and make sure that their decisions regarding the principal align to this purpose. If the goal is to maximize wealth in the long term, withdrawing from the principal might not be the best strategy. And then finally, states should consider volatility in investment earnings when deciding their use in law. So we talked about some state examples earlier. So states are using investment earnings and overall earnings from their fund to support any kind of operating fund. States need to be aware of volatility and be aware of how much risk they're taking on so that doesn't impact state operating budgets year to year. So with that, thank you so much for joining me today. And Faith, I will kick it back over to you for Q&A.
Great, thank you, Patrick. All right, so we do have a little bit of time for some questions here, and I have a few submitted so far. Okay, so let's start out with this first question. Can you explain how sovereign wealth funds are different from rainy day funds?
Sure, we're happy to talk about that. This is Brenna. So as Patrick mentioned early in his presentation, there's a really fundamental difference between the two of them. And I think that the important point to remember is that a rainy day fund is intended for that budget stabilization purpose in most places. It is intended to be a resource to balance budgets in the short term. It's also a resource that can be looked to in some jurisdictions for kind of short-term budget planning, like the year ahead. So in some cases, it's for a current year shortfall. Maybe it's for a foreseen shortfall. But because of that, rainy day fund balances are kept primarily in cash and cash equivalents, very short-term notes, things like that. They may grow very large in nominal terms, but they're not, nor are they intended to be actively invested in pursuit of high return. So on the flip side, sovereign wealth fund may grow also, ideally will grow to be a very large, to have a large corpus, like a large fund balance, but its purpose is more like a state pension fund in the sense that the principal is not meant to be accessed on a short-term basis. It's not meant to be used to fill in a budget shortfall. It's meant to be invested in any number of types of securities, some of which are relatively illiquid. So once it's invested, it's either costly or not particularly possible to pull that money out on a short-term basis. I would also stress, too, that as Patrick pointed out in his presentation, that with a sovereign wealth fund, just as with a pension fund or something like that, when you withdraw from the principal, you would impede the fund's ability to yield those returns. As the purpose of the fund is really to supply an alternative revenue source that would help the state diversify away over time from fossil fuel dependence.
All right, let's move on to our next question. Let's see. How much money do U.S. states hold in sovereign wealth funds?
So looking at just the 7 funds that we focused on, the severance tax-based sovereign wealth funds, there are nearly $70 billion held by these 7 funds, but the majority of these assets are actually held by Alaska, who has a balance of $53 billion. Wyoming has $7 billion, New Mexico has $4 billion, and North Dakota currently has $3 billion.
Yeah, I would actually note in addition that a number of these funds are relatively young. They haven't been in existence for even a decade, let alone, 3 or 4 years in some cases. And that while there are a lot of international examples of sovereign wealth funds that have grown very large, of course, Patrick mentioned Norway, there are many others as well. What happens is typically when the funds grow to a certain size, then there's more that the states can really do with them. The larger the fund corpus, the larger the investment return. And by investing them both extensively domestically and globally, that revenue source is fundamentally more diversified than, say, the severance tax base that the fund was built on.
All right, thank you. Another question we have here is, are there sovereign wealth funds in the United States that are supported by sources other than severance taxes?
Yes, there are. Those weren't the focus of our current research, but there are examples such as state land trusts. Example would be Texas's University Fund and School Fund. So there are other types of funds that qualify as sovereign wealth funds, but again, the focus that we had was specifically on those funded by severance taxes.
All right, next question. In the maps where you showed which states currently have severance-based sovereign wealth funds, are there other states on there that have the ability to have those but don't yet have them?
Yes, I think that it's possible that any state that has a significant amount of revenue currently from severance tax, or whose economy is heavily invested in some respect in energy industries, has, potentially the opportunity to do this. A couple that I would flag along those lines would include Oklahoma and Texas and Louisiana. And going back to the map that you referenced, we had Louisiana shaded because there is actually a ballot initiative that will go before Louisiana voters this November that would create a severance tax-based sovereign wealth fund if it's approved. So there's been interest in that idea. In Oklahoma and Texas, interestingly, they're the 2 states that collect more than 5% of their total revenues any given year from severance taxes, and yet they are the only 2 that collect that much in severance tax relative to their portfolio that don't have a freestanding sovereign wealth fund.
Great. Well, thank you both. Those are all the questions we've received so far. Do you guys have any final remarks that you'd like to make?
I would just note that the title of the brief is the title of the presentation, and it will be out in the next couple of weeks. And if anyone is interested in being included on our media release and being made aware when it's available, then we'd be happy to make that happen. And thanks for everyone's interest.
Yes, I just want to thank you again for having me on this webinar.
Great, and thank you both so much. I also want to thank all of our guests for joining us today. If anyone would like to access this webinar later, it will be posted in a few weeks' time, and you'll be able to find it by going to the View Past Webinars button at the bottom of the CSG eAcademy page. And also be sure to check our CSG website for information on future eAcademy webinars on finance and other policy areas. My name is Faith James at CSG West Sacramento. Thank you.